Good morning, everyone. My name is Kristen. I am a hospice chaplain at LA Home and Hospice, very recently former resident of Michelle, who's on the call. So I'm happy to say the program works, and job placement has so far been good. But I have the very wonderful privilege of introducing our speaker today. Our speaker is Bryce Woyak. He is a recent clinical pastoral education intern who's been working at Lakeland Medical Center and Aurora Medical Center in Burlington. Bryce is a Wiccan high priest from the Alexandrian tradition, and he is going to be presenting today a talk called Palliative Care Concerns for the Wiccan Patients. Bryce is going to be speaking for about 15 to 20 minutes, and after that, we'll facilitate a question and answer time. So Bryce, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Kristen, and happy Friday to everyone. I don't know about you all, but I'm looking forward to the weekend and the nice warm weather. As Kristen mentioned, my name is Bryce Woyak, and I'm a Wiccan high priest from the Alexandrian tradition. As a chaplaincy student, I am also just wrapping up my second unit of clinical pastoral education with Advocate Aurora Health, where I've been serving at Lakeland Medical Center and Aurora Medical Center Burlington for the last 9 months. So thank you all for welcoming me to today's presentation, and a special thank you to Michelle Laycock for inviting me to present today. Before we jump into the topic this morning, I'm going to have us take a step back to examine what it is we mean when we say Wicca. In today's world, the term Wicca doesn't refer to a single belief system. Instead, it's more accurate if we think of Wicca as a collection of similar traditions. You can kind of think of this like the term Protestantism in a Christian context. Protestantism is an umbrella term for many different Christian denominations rather than a single religion. And Wicca is much the same in this respect. Though in Wicca, we refer to these different strands as traditions rather than denominations. You will also hear Wiccans of all genders refer to themselves as witches, and some people in the community really do prefer the term witch rather than Wiccan. For us, witch is a sacred priestly title. It's a bit like how Franciscan and Jesuit are priestly titles for specific Roman Catholic orders. The title of witch for us denotes that we are priestesses and priests in a sacred relationship with our gods. I'll take a minute also here to note that there are many, many people who aren't of a Wiccan tradition, but who do use the word witch to describe their spiritual path. To keep things simple for today's presentation, I'm going to use the words Wicca and Wiccan to avoid any confusion. However, it's important for all of us here to make note that some people from a Wiccan path prefer to be called witch, and that they prefer to refer to their religion as witchcraft rather than Wicca. Like I said, there are many different Wiccan traditions, and a lot of these traditions share some core beliefs. But the way that the different traditions and individuals in those traditions express these beliefs can vary considerably. There's no central authority in Wicca, and the way beliefs are taught, understood, and ritualized depends on the tradition, the group of practitioners, a unit that we call a coven, as well as the experience of the individual Wiccan. All of this is to say that there is no one Wiccan way to do things, including dealing with illness, death, or loss. There are, however, many common elements and much common vocabulary shared between traditions, and palliative care providers can lean into these commonalities to create an environment that upholds the dignity of a Wiccan patient's religion and spirituality. So some good news there for us this morning. At its core, Wicca is a fertility religion. It connects humans with the ebbs and the flows of the natural world. Just as the moon waxes and wanes through her phases, and the crops grow, die, and come back through the seasons, so do Wiccans see humans as part of the natural cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Following the example set by nature, then, many Wiccans believe in reincarnation, and that at the end of our physical life, our spirits continue on to be born again. Some Wiccans believe that the spirit rests between incarnations in an otherworldly realm, which is often referred to as the Summerlands. And it's in the Summerlands that the spirit may review lessons learned from the previous life while getting ready for its next incarnation. So that's a term you might hear if you're working with a Wiccan patient who is dealing with facing death. For Wiccans, then, death isn't a frightening end, but a transition into a different state of life, much like how birth was a transition into a different state of life. You may hear Wiccans refer to death even as a rebirth day, or they may refer to the dying person as a traveler, as their spirit prepares to disembark into another life. We take death seriously, as it's a sacred time of transition, but we also tend to do so with a light heart, because for us, we know it's not an end. Wicca acknowledges feminine and masculine aspects of divinity. We have a goddess and a god, and both our goddess and our god have aspects associated with death and the beyond. Our god in particular is associated with death, as he is the horned god of death and resurrection, and is linked with the hunt and the regeneration of crops. I'll take a moment here to note that while he's called the horn god, he is actually more often depicted with stag antlers than actual horns. Our goddess also takes on a death aspect as the crone, or sometimes called the dark mother. In this way, she personifies the waning and the dark moons, and it's she who stirs the cauldron of regeneration and gives immortality to the soul. A Wiccan facing death or serious illness then may connect with these darker faces of the gods in a variety of ways. Wicca is by and large a religion of priests and priestesses. We do not put a mediator between us and our gods, and so we often conduct our own services. To this end, a Wiccan approaching death may set up altars or shrines dedicated to these faces of divinity, and they may use meditation or ritual to connect with both the gods and the ancestors during their transition through illness and death. If you happen to be part of a care team that does home visits for a Wiccan patient, you may see an altar set up with an assortment of tools such as statuary, ritual knives, candles, and objects collected from nature. It's important that these spaces are respected. They're sacred places. So please don't handle objects on the altar. Don't set things on it. Many Wiccans hold a belief that religious tools should only be touched by their owner. And if you're unsure if an area is a sacred space, you can politely ask the patient, would it be okay if I set something down here? Or would it be okay if I move this? There's no harm in asking. Wiccans also practice magic. In fact, magic is really the bedrock of our religious expression. In our religion, magic is a sacred act that we use to meet our gods and to participate in divine creation. It's normal for Wiccan patients to use spells and charms to aid their journey through illness and death. And it's not uncommon for Wiccans to have physical representations of their magical work around their homes or even on their person. This includes things like charm bags, amulets, and jewelry made from particular metals, stones, and other natural materials. These items should be respected in the same way as our sacred spaces, like altars, are respected. Magical paraphernalia should not be handled without the permission from the patient. For a Wiccan patient facing end of life in the hospital, it may be important to have certain tools present, especially things such as incense, candles, and items from the natural world like stones or particular plants. It would be incredibly inclusive and impactful for a member of the care team to ask a Wiccan patient if there are any religious tools or images that they would like with them while in the hospital, and for the care team to help coordinating getting these items into the hospital. Due to stigma, Wiccan patients are not likely to proactively ask that items from their religion be present, even if this may be important to them. Now, of course, some ritual tools may not be allowed in an inpatient venue. For example, ritual knives are very important to a number of Wiccan traditions, but they may not be permissible on a medical campus. So you may need to negotiate what is appropriate for the setting. For most things, a substitute can be found. Get creative. Oils can be substituted for incenses, electric candles for candle flames, etc. Work with your patient to determine what is appropriate for both their religious expression and the inpatient or other setting that you find yourselves in. Wiccans tend to be a highly creative lot, so coming up with a plan B is probably going to be just as much of a fun exercise as it would be going through with plan A. If your location offers extra healing modalities such as Reiki, acupuncture, or aromatherapy, these may be appreciated by a Wiccan patient. Our religion focuses on the subtle, interconnected energies of life, And we see many of these additional healing modalities as connecting with these same subtle energies. It would be appropriate to ask Wiccan patients if they are interested in these services while in the hospital setting. When it comes to illness, we need space for our magic alongside Western medicine, and both are sometimes needed for healing, whether that healing is through the body recovering or transitioning into death. To this extent, the care team should do well to avoid comments such as, "I wish I could wave a magic wand and make this all go away," or other such sentiments that may trivialize our very real religious expression. Now, as I mentioned, Wiccan patients may be reluctant to ask for spiritual resources or even to share their religious identity. So a Wiccan patient may not have their religion listed in the chart, or the religion listed may not be accurate. After all, it wasn't that long ago that Wiccans faced custody battles and lost their jobs because of their religious affiliation. And there is still stigma against Wiccans in many communities. This, of course, doesn't mean that Wiccan patients don't have religious needs that impact their care. It just means that they may not feel safe voicing these needs, or even that it's appropriate for them to mention these needs. To this extent, I encourage the care team to keep their eyes open for signs that a patient may be Wiccan, such as the wearing of a pentacle, which is a 5-pointed star in a circle, a common symbol used in Wicca as well as other pagan religions. The presence of shrines and altars in the home may be a good indication. Art of the divine feminine or goddesses, and talk of magic or charms are other good indications. Of course, none of these mean that a patient is for sure a Wiccan, but they are good starting points for a conversation about the patient's spiritual beliefs. It can be very impactful simply to acknowledge these practices in an affirming manner. For example, you could say out loud with your patient, "I get a sense that you have some important spiritual beliefs. I'm wondering if there's anything the care team can do to support your beliefs and practices during this time." Some patients, like I mentioned, might not be willing to bring this up proactively. And so by offering them an invitation to openly discuss their spirituality, you may get them to go deeper into what they need during their transition through illness and death. For chaplains and others offering spiritual care services to Wiccan patients, it's important to use inclusive language. As I'm sure we're all aware, in our culture, the idea of a chaplain oftentimes conjures up a Christian minister. Because of this, Wiccan patients may not understand how a chaplain would be helpful, and they may even feel threatened by the presence of a chaplain. So it can be helpful to refer to chaplaincy as spiritual care, and to chaplains as spiritual care providers, at least at the outset of the relationship with the interdisciplinary care team. Also, when offering spiritual care services to Wiccan patients, it is helpful to state that the spiritual care team works with patients of all religions and spiritualities. You'll probably also want to avoid terms like pastoral care and faith, both of which have heavy Christian overtones and aren't likely to connect for Wiccan patients. I'll also note that prayer is a word that might not connect for Wiccan patients. Many Wiccan traditions don't have a strong sense of prayer, and sentiments like, "I will keep you in my prayers," or "I'm praying for you," may actually elicit negative emotional responses due to past history. Try instead asking if you may offer a blessing, or asking permission to keep the patient in your thoughts. Wicca is very big on consent, so always be sure to ask, and don't be disheartened if the patient declines your offer. The patient may be doing their own energy work, and they may not want the interferences of outside thoughts and energies. This isn't uncommon. For the interdisciplinary care team, you'll want to use some discretion when charting on your Wiccan patients' religion and spiritual practices. Some Wiccans are not open about their religion with their family, and they may not want this information in the chart. Similarly, many Wiccans uphold a sense of secrecy when it comes to ritual, magic, and membership of a coven. If these details are disclosed to you as a member of the care team, they should be kept confidential and not discussed with others. These are sacred things that the patient is sharing with you. It's a sacred part of their journey that they're entrusting with you. If you do need to chart or otherwise discuss an element of a patient's religious practice, get permission from the patient and then use neutral language, such as mentioning that the patient is an active member of a religious group, or that the patient has been engaging in spiritual practices during admission. As always, check with the patient to understand what would be appropriate to chart and what would be appropriate to communicate to others. In all of this, ultimately, the most important thing that the palliative care team can do for a Wiccan patient is to create an inclusive, safe, and non-judgmental space for the patient to engage with their religion during this sacred transition through illness and death. I'm sure everyone on the call today has ideas of what a witch is and what magic is. We've all inherited these ideas from popular culture, and some of us may have even inherited these ideas from our own religious backgrounds. In working with Wiccan patients, it's vital that we suspend these judgments, and I'll hazard to say we should try to suspend these judgments elsewhere in our lives as well. Again, witch is a title we use as priestesses and priests of our gods. Magic is an incredibly sacred act of worship. Our God has horns that links him to hunt and the need for survival. And tools like sacred knives, cauldrons, and brooms are how we connect to divinity. These are all sacred words, acts, and images for us. Wiccans celebrate the rising and the setting of the sun, the growing and the shrinking of the moon, and both the light and the dark times of the year. Giving us space to celebrate our journey through illness and death is by far the most important thing that the care team can do. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to the questions and the discussion. I've seen that some have been coming in as I've been talking.
Thank you, Bryce. That was such a clear and helpful overview of Wiccan practice, so really appreciate it. Michelle had two questions that touch upon the issue of prayer and blessing that I thought I'd highlight. The first was, if a family wanted prayer, would that be helpful? I may have a follow-up question about that. I can imagine for the Wiccan patients that I have met, there tends to be some conflict with their family's religious past. And so I can imagine some difficulty there in trying to provide spiritual care to the patient and family members. With that in mind, let's actually just deal with that first question from Michelle.
Yes, it's a really good question. And Kristen, I think you hit on a very good point there, is that for a lot of Wiccan patients, there's still a divide between the family religion, the religion from their family of origin, and the patient's religion. And this can make prayer for the patient uncomfortable, because that's something that a lot of us have gone through in our past, where folks will pray for us that we believe the Wiccan religion. And so there's some stigma and bias in our own lives attached to that, because it kind of comes across as almost threatening. So in that situation, really, I would, again, ask the patient for their permission if they're able to give it. If the patient is in a non-conversational state, it might be worthwhile exploring with the family if this is something that they feel their loved one would be comfortable with, or to really offer the prayer as a way of consoling the family and a way of praying for the family, that the family may be strong during this transition, that the family and all surrounding the family may know that they are loved and that they are graciously guided through this difficult time. Now, it's a bit of a tenuous place to walk, and it does require a little bit of thinking before acting.
I'm sure. Michelle also asked what an appropriate blessing might be. Do you have any ideas?
Good question. A lot of Wiccan blessings tend to be very extemporaneous. We're very much folks who create our own rituals and create our own spaces. So giving words from the heart that connect with natural imagery, or using even a poem. There are a number of good, actually, pagan prayer books out there. There are a couple that have been released in the last few years that give poems and other blessings that would be appropriate for Wiccan patients as they relate heavily to the natural world and to kind of the idea that the moon wanes, but we know that she's going to come back again as a silver crescent, or the crops die and are harvested, but we know that they are going to be born again from the earth. And so do we know that during this transition, we will die, and then we will be born as all things on earth show us.
It's beautiful. Marty, did you want to ask your question out loud?
I'd love to. So, Bryce, I've met I've met some patients in the past, not Wiccan, but who have expressed beliefs about reincarnation. And part of what they've shared with me is that their situation at the end of life, whether they're comfortable or whether there's chaos in the room or whether they're having pain or whether they're sedated, all these things, they impact their reincarnation. And sometimes that has some implications in their choices about whether or not they agree to have CPR or be on life support. Is that the case at all with what you have experienced?
Not what I've experienced from a Wiccan setting. Reincarnation for most Wiccans tends to be not, how do I put this? It's definitely tied to our physical life, in that we are here, we're learning lessons, and then we die, and then our spirit goes on to a place where it can learn new lessons. But it's really much more in that teaching and that lesson sort of paradigm, and not so much bound up kind of in the idea of karma or in the idea of actions in our current life holding us or predicating what type of life we will have in the next life. Does that answer that question?
That does. There's some variation there.
Yes.
Bryce, what you just said reminded me of a question I was thinking about as you talked, which is in a lot of religions, there's some concept of punishment. There's like a punitive element to it, which can motivate people while they're living and also cause them some fear and distress while they're dying. And I wondered if there's any element of that within Wicca that could come up at the end of life.
Definitely. I think that really comes up in this concept of karma. And I know this is a little confusing because I just said our ideas of reincarnation aren't tied to karma in the same way as some Eastern religions are, for example. But karma is still a concept for many modern Wiccans. And our responsibility with karma is basically that what we give out, we receive. And some folks will say what they give out, they receive threefold back. And so folks who are struggling through illness or through a traumatic death, for example, may very realistically be in a little bit of despair saying, this is my karma, what did I do? I don't really hear that as often, but it is definitely something that comes up every now and kind of those moments of despair. For us, the idea of kind of karma and, I guess, judgment, as you will, is really more so tied to the fact that we're witches, we're co-creators of our reality. So we're the stopping point to take responsibility for our actions. And that can be a difficult place to be, especially when you're dealing with something such as like an illness that was brought on by actions done over years, such as substance abuse or smoking. So those can be some difficult conversations of just navigating the spiritual waters of how do I sit with the fact that I created my own universe and this is where I'm at now.
Thank you. Are there rituals for Wiccans to sort of cope with where they're at, like create a sense of, so I'm obviously asking this out of my own tradition. I come from a Christian background. We have all of our things that we do to try to seek forgiveness and obtain a sense of peace at the end of life, right? So I'm thinking about, in your tradition, are there shared practices that people perform to try to get a sense of acceptance for their own situation?
There are not shared practices around that.
Okay.
There are definitely some resources out there for kind of basically trauma-based pagan spiritual care, which is appropriate for Wiccans as well, for certain situations. But there's nothing by and large as like a consensus or a general right that we would use for it. A lot of Wiccans tend to use meditation as a way to kind of explore and get in touch with their own spiritual being as well as their gods and the spirits that they work with. So that's a common tool that is used for happiness and sadness. So in those moments of kind of despair and life review, that can be a very helpful tool, is some guided meditation and sitting with that. There's also a tendency among Wiccans to ritualize a lot of very intense events to get kind of into that magic state of being able to be one with divine creation, so that you can understand and you can create, you can bend and shape. And that might be another avenue to go, although there are no, like I said, no standard rituals for that. So it would be more of a collaborative thing of working with the patient to figure out what would be most helpful and what would you find appropriate.
Thanks, Bryce. That's really helpful. And I did notice Marty, I noticed Nick's question. I'll save that to the end. Roberto, did you have something?
Yeah, as I was listening, I was thinking of a question. Is there my experience has been limited. I probably saw like 3 patients who were of this tradition. And I wonder if you, are you aware, Bryce, if there is a connection in this hemisphere? Like when I go to Mexico, and is there like, I was thinking of our tradition of curanderas, which is women and men and healers, like they use herbs and they use the moon and they use the stars. Are you familiar with any connections between the different sides of the hemisphere, North America, South America, or are you familiar with anything?
So the answer to your question is yes and no.
Okay.
Yes, in the fact that a lot of the practices that are used in Wicca come from European folk magic, and European folk magic is very much mimics a lot of other folk magic practices around the world, and that it draws from local flora and fauna, the stars, the seasons, etc. So that's kind of a theme we just kind of see throughout religio magic systems the world over. So in that way, yes, they are related, because there's that longer human desire to connect with nature and perform healing and divination through natural means. In terms of actual kind of religious milieu, no. Wicca really comes out of the UK in the 1960s and then spreads onto the European continent and then over to the United States shortly thereafter. Since that time, coming into modern day, there has been some crossover into like Mexico and into Spanish-speaking countries, where you might see books out there on brujeria that's specifically for Wicca and not these more traditional forms of magic working.
Okay, yes, I hear you. Brujeria, yeah.
Thanks, Bryce. We had what I think will be our last question given time. We'll see. Are you aware of any resources that might be helpful for a palliative care team dealing with these topics?
Yes, there are a couple. There are a couple of books that I would recommend. First off, there's a book out there called The Pagan Book of Living and Dying by Starhawk and Maca Nightmare, which is a good kind of overview of a lot of pan-pagan beliefs, so beliefs that extend widely across general paganism in the United States, which includes a lot of Wiccan traditions, so that's useful. There's also a book that just came out this year called Do I Have to Wear Black by Mortellus, and it is looking at end-of-life rituals for people from all different pagan walks. And there is a chapter, and there are 2 chapters in there actually about Wicca specifically. So that's been a really interesting and very helpful resource. There are also, as I'm thinking, there are 2 pagan prayer books that came out recently, and I cannot remember their names off the top of my head. So forgive me as I type a little and go into my Amazon history to remember them, but they came out rather recently, and they give a lot of, kind of talking about that natural blessings, like basing blessings in the natural world can be very impactful. They give a lot of good recommendations for those, and those might be good things just to have on hand in a spiritual care office. While I'm pulling up those titles, I'll also mention that one of the other things you can do is just start making some inroads in the local pagan communities. There is specifically like in the Milwaukee area, there's a Milwaukee area Pagans page, which is a good place to just kind of go ask questions, meet a couple people, and great resources there. For example, if you had a Wiccan patient or a patient from a different pagan path who was looking to connect it with some sort of clergy from their tradition, that would be a great place just to reach out, just to put something on the Facebook wall there. And a lot of other areas also have similar things. Like I'm from the Madison area, so there's a Madison area pagan Facebook group, etc. So those would be the resources that come to the top of my mind. I'm sorry, I'm still digging through books here. Oh, here it is. The two books I was thinking of were A Wound in Time, Pagan Prayers for a Modern World, and Elemental Voices, Pagan Prayers for a Modern Planet. And both of those are by Lucia Moreno Velo.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bryce. And I'll make a list of these resources and can pass them along to Marty, who will email everyone after the Chalk Talk. This is informative and interesting, and I'm so glad you were here with us, Bryce. Marty, did you have any closing announcements?
Nothing other than to thank you, Bryce. We really appreciate your time with us today.
Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate you all for sitting in with me on a wonderful Friday morning. And yeah, I wish you all of the best and that you have a wonderful summer. It's so needed after what felt like a year of a dark, cold winter.